The title of this presentation is The Future of Helicopters. In reality, it's the future of aviation, where we're going to discuss the integration and tracking of helicopters and unmanned aerial systems in low-level airspace. My name is Mike Becker, and I'm a helicopter and fixed-wing pilot, having had my license since 1985. I have over 15,000 flight hours, and with my wife Jan, operate a helicopter company with over 15 jet ranges and 2 global ranges in Australia. Being able to fly is in our DNA. This talk is about airspace, but more importantly, the future of general aviation and the integration of all aerial vehicles in the low-level airspace where helicopters typically operate. Some of the material in this presentation is going to be a bit tongue-in-cheek. There are some facts in there. I've also taken a few wags, wild-ass guesses, for those of you that don't know. I also occasionally take a shot at our aviation regulators. So, if you have a weak heart muscle, if you can't handle some colourful language or some radical ideas, if you do not like to consider change, I'd probably pack up and leave now. But if you want to know where our future could be, if you want to look at aviation in a different manner, if you are willing to consider a massive paradigm shift, then turn off your phone, close your laptop, stay in that seat and listen up. In 1897, the first metered gas-powered taxi cab began operating in Stuttgart, Germany. Since that date, government agencies, local, state and federal around the world have gone about regulating the taxi industry so that only those that paid exorbitant amounts of money in licensing fees could be approved to drive and operate one in accordance with the government-sanctioned rule set. In effect, there was a government-approved monopoly on hiring road transport. This was to the detriment of the service and prevented a better or different way of doing things to come into existence. This model was here to stay, by hook or by crook. The taxi operators wanted it to stay to protect their industry, and the regulators, they wanted it to stay because of the revenues they received. The status quo was set and was to continue into the future, or so we all thought. In 2015, Uber came into existence and the unthinkable happened. The rules of the game changed overnight. And no amount of complaint or influence by the incumbent taxi operators or the regulators could counter the change in the masses deciding to take advantage of a new way of doing things. The advances in technology and communication brought about a paradigm shift, a rule shift, a regulator shift. Interestingly, it was really just history repeating itself, as for sure the horse and cart drivers got really upset when this smelly, noisy thing called a car came on the scene and tried to replace them in the same way Uber is replacing the existing taxi paradigm of today. In my opinion, the helicopter industry, and in fact the entire general aviation industry, stands at the same brink of change. Let's call it our future Uber moment. It does not matter what we think. We cannot avoid it. We cannot stop it. It's coming. Just how far off it is, I am not sure, but we certainly have a bright light on the horizon, a dawn of a new era about to materialize. What we can do and should do is be part of it. Aviation is changing. No longer do we deal with machines that are solely flown by a person up front in the cockpit. No more do we have a clear distinction between what is a helicopter and what is a fixed wing, what is an ultralight or a gyrocopter, with the odd non-powered aircraft, balloons, parachutes, paragliders and gliders thrown in for good measure. No more are we simply managing a liquid that is being consumed by a piston or a turbine engine to create power to move an airflow over a fixed or rotary wing for flight. No longer do we need complex drivetrains, transmissions, and greasable bearings. No more are we having to look at a compass, read a map, calculate a 1 in 60 on a whiz wheel, understand and manage pressure instruments, and be solely responsible for piloting our aircraft and all that entails. Flight planning and management, weather management, fatigue management, in-flight management, engine management, flying skill management, airmanship management, navigation management, airspace management, regulator management, recency management, etc., 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 all start to fade into the background as technology advances. The hero, all-knowing pilot is no more. The aircraft age of the 20th century, sadly, is coming to an end. Instead, we're going to be dealing with a new breed of aerial vehicle that are going to be more diverse but simplistic in design, more reliable in their construction, and more flexible in their capabilities, and more autonomous in their management. So the question must be asked, just what is an aerial vehicle? Is this an aerial vehicle? Are these aerial vehicles? They can now come in all sorts of shapes, sizes, configurations, and designs. Interestingly, these aerial vehicles can be both manned and unmanned. They can do all sorts of jobs. And interestingly enough, some of the jobs helicopters have never been able to do successfully, they may well be able to do in the future. And be accepted by the public, not simply because they make less noise, but because the public now wants this affordable, convenient service with the noise. And the perceived risks, they can be brushed over by convenience, price, and profit. Is something that has no moving parts, multiple electric motors and fixed pitch rotors, a solid state power source, a battery, required to be flown, operated, or both? Is it a helicopter, a drone, or a fixed wing? Would you classify this as a multi-engine aircraft? Where do we draw the lines? And just what does the operator, pilot, need to know in order to safely operate this vehicle? And most importantly, who should have oversight of it as a regulator? Who is going to manage the standards, set and administer the rules? Just when is a helicopter or fixed wing called a drone, and when is a drone called a helicopter or a fixed wing? How do we separate the differences in the way a vehicle flies, how it is powered and how it is operated or piloted compared to our current paradigm? How do we define the differences between balloons, gyrocopters, ultralights, helicopters, fixed wing and drones, UAVs, paragliders, hang gliders, so on and so on and so on? In the old or current paradigm, our incumbent regulators decide the distinctions, and we have a myriad of rules in the name of safety to control it. In the new paradigm, I propose the answer is simple. We don't separate them. We don't care how it flies, only that it does. The differences in design will become irrelevant. It will not matter how a vehicle is powered, how it operates or flies, whether it has wings or rotors or anti-gravity capabilities. What matters is that we all operate within the same airspace to a common rule set under which we are able to communicate and see and avoid each other. Since World War I, the world has either relied on a strategy of individual countries setting rules for aviation based on a standard decided on by some old men in a room in Chicago and the establishing of the International Civil Aviation Organization, or ICAO. Or if the country was too poor and could not comply with the rules, then they didn't comply. They simply ignored the rule set and determined what worked for them because complying was too difficult. Interestingly, ICAO is referred to as the International Civil Aviation Organization because it had to be distinct from the military after World War I, and it was primarily created to manage aircraft that were crossing international borders, particularly in Europe and the Americas. Each member country then had the job to individually interpret and apply the policies coming out of the ICAO, and this has led to vastly differing interpretations of the standards and rules using the same flying devices. Having the exact same aircraft and flying the exact same way in each individual aircraft seemed to be irrelevant, as each individual country built a monopoly with a self-regulated government department that was and is intent on building rules under the guise of safety to control an industry. It is actually a flawed system to have a regulator whose sole purpose is to make rules, and when they have made rules, to make more rules and audit themselves against those rules before making more rules in order to keep their jobs. It is not sustainable, and we as an industry have finally hit the limits in our ability to cope with the amount of regulation, let alone understand and interpret them. To me, it sounds a lot like the taxi industry. This is protectionism and exclusivism in its extreme, and we are all being let down by the lack of ability for these regulators to change and move with the times, and their lack of ability to communicate across the globe to have a consensus in rulemaking, let alone a sensible and workable consultation within the country with the very people operating the flying equipment. Although this type of regulation may have been relevant in the post-war era and even right up into the late 1970s and early 1980s, since then we have been in a steady decline where the airline business has boomed and driven outcomes, and the regulators are doing their best to free up the skies, get rid of general aviation and hand it over to the airlines. They have got pretty close. General aviation is dead in Europe. EASA, or as I like to call it, Eradicate Aviation for Safety Authority, sorted that one. The air traffic privatisation bill almost got through in the United States, where the FAA was going to hand over all of the airspace to be controlled by the airlines. Australian general aviation has been decimated over the last 10 to 15 years, with most smaller piston planes now living in barns around the country. And this is really only the countries I'm familiar with. Civil aviation authorities around the world have let general aviation, and in particular helicopters, down. It's now time for a change. I say, let the incumbent regulators look after the airlines who operate above 10,000 feet, and let the general aviation community form a new global alliance that manages aerial vehicles below 10,000 feet outside of controlled airspace to a common rule set that transcends borders. How is this going to be possible? How will individual governments relinquish control in this manner? Some will say it will never happen. Impossible. Delusional. Don't forget, they said the exact same thing about Uber. We all know that change is driven by the masses, because the masses have two things in common with big business. They vote, and they determine the flow of money. Simple. Supply and demand. Politicians will drive this change because they will be voted in to make the change and be funded to do so. Fickle lot, politicians. They go with the loudest voice and those who pay the bill. Follow the masses, follow big business, direct the money, politicians will follow. Based on this thinking, in my opinion, we are on the cusp of a dramatic change, and the helicopter industry needs to embrace it and be at the forefront. This is something we can lead. The drone and UAV industry is about to boom, and boom bigger than anything we have ever seen in aviation since the advent of the airliner in the 1950s. We can already imagine the skies as we see them in science fiction movies such as Star Wars, Star Trek, Guardians of the Galaxy and Blade Runner, to name just a few. Highways in the sky, personalised self-driven transport drones, small survey drones, piloted helicopter type vehicles, all sharing the same airspace. In fact, just about every image of the future has both manned and unmanned aerial vehicles of all shapes and sizes, speeds and abilities to maneuver, all mixing it up together in big highways in the sky, all going in different directions at varying altitudes, doing different jobs in apparent harmony as automated algorithms work away in the background to ensure separation. The operators of such vehicles do not seem to have to undergo the intense training and standardization that our current commercial pilots have to go through for each different category in every individual country. As we all know, much of the rubbish we expect a new pilot to learn these days is completely outdated and irrelevant to the modern and changing technological environment. nor do the rules by which they operate seem to be that restrictive, with excursions on and off the aerial highways and multiple drones going about their daily work a very common scenario. Everyone seems to be able to operate one. They seem to be very simple and often self-managed, autonomous even, pre-programmed, certainly universally accepted. None of them seem to be crashing into each other or going out of control. Those that do are accepted as a natural consequence of the numbers in the sky, accepted in the same manner as the crashes, incidents and deaths we accept on our roads with our current modes of transport on an hourly basis. With that in mind, in Australia, there were 1,227 deaths in 2017 due to motor vehicle accidents. In the USA, there were 40,100 deaths in 2017 attributable to motor vehicle accidents. Yet, this hardly even registers a news item in the paper or TV. It seems to be so common and evidently totally acceptable. We as road users never really hear of or feel the ramifications of a rule change. Certainly no operator's manuals impart something or other to be introduced to curb the accident rate. As you know, in the helicopter world, if we have 1 or 2 fatals a year, then there is this massive knee-jerk reaction. The media replay it over and over and over with spectacular footage, and our regulators force a change in the rules. And of course, we are all unsafe cowboys and cowgirls that the regulators feel they must do something about to satisfy the public condemnation. The amount of regulation and change we experience in aviation is disproportionate to the number of deaths. It's a massive furphy that we are expected to pay for. These new aerial vehicles of the future seem to be used just as our cars are used today. The operator does not need to have an in-depth knowledge of the technology driving them. They simply need to know how to start it, stop it, and get it to where they want it to go, and occasionally run through a drive-through to keep it clean or drop it into a garage where they get a loaner before picking it up at the end of the day. This will be our future, and the helicopter will be just another aerial vehicle used in this manner. Who knows? The helicopter may end up being the vintage aerial vehicle driven for pleasure by enthusiasts or crusty old buggers like me on a Sunday afternoon. Wife in tow and picnic hamper on the liver. No beer or wine, of course, and on a salt-free diet. We need to get on board. Let's team up with the Amazons, Googles, DHLs and UPSs of the world, and let's manage the change and deliver this new service and product that is already fast becoming mainstream. The big manufacturers, the OEMs, are already there. They get it. They are in preparation and they will support this change because it helps them sell more equipment. No longer is Bell Helicopter called Bell Helicopter. It is simply called Bell, with a dragonfly as the symbol. Same with Airbus, Leonardo, Sikorsky, etc. Why? Because they see a big future in manufacturing drones and UAVs and no longer want to be associated with just the vintage helicopter or just a fit-for-purpose fixed-wing. Our OEMs are becoming androgynous for a reason. Even our associations are considering changing their names to take away the word helicopter and instead replace it with words like vertical lift or aerial vehicle in some manner. It's very interesting times. Let us decide how we are going to manage the airspace and control the aerial vehicles within that airspace. Let us not sit back and wait for our current regulators to decide our fate over the next 30 years in the same manner they have over-regulated most things to do with general aviation over the preceding 30 years. Okay, it's time to get serious and lay out the solution, not just to sit here and whinge about the problem and as usual blame our regulators for the failures. So what could be a plan? Well, first up, we need new thinking. Old thinking is not going to take us to new places. This new thinking then has to be acted upon. Like all new thinking, great ideas simply come from asking the right questions. Einstein once said that if he had 1 hour to solve a problem and his life depended on it, he would spend 55 minutes coming up with the right question. For me, the primary question is, how do we integrate the airspace to achieve this dream? My answer, as stated previously, is to divide the airspace into two separate segments, above 10,000 feet and below 10,000 feet. Above 10,000 feet, the current rule set and regulators can have all the airspace and the airlines can go about their merry business. If we operate in their airspace above 10,000 feet, we comply to their rules. They would never come into our airspace unless climbing up to their cruising altitude or descending into an airport or in the event of an emergency. Airline traffic and private jets flying above 10,000 feet will see very little change whether they are manned or unmanned. They will fly to and from designated hubs, climbing and descending through airspace that is controlled and that excludes any other type of aerial vehicle, unless it has an ADS-B transponder and is in communication with the air traffic controller under an airways clearance, pretty much like the system we have right now. The upside-down weddy cake model will still exist, but it will get much smaller the closer to the ground to minimize the controlled airspace and maximize the airspace available for users below 10,000 feet. Controlled airspace around an airport should not exceed 3 nautical miles, and the first tier of the wedding cake should start outside of that at 1,500 feet AGL. In fact, I would think in some areas the airspace may even turn on and off, so that if an airliner is coming into a regional airport, as well as this being programmed and planned, the moving map display on an EFB could flash orange to give a 30-minute warning to allow aerial vehicles to either vacate land or turn on their ADS-B transponders and communicate with ATC, and then red as the airspace becomes controlled airspace for the 30 minutes the airliner is below 10,000 feet. Any autonomous vehicle would either vacate the area, land, or automatically register within the system. Our worldwide airspace model is already designed and managed with this aim in mind. The regulators will change their names to reflect their new terms of reference. The Australian Civil Aviation Authority, CASA, will become the Commercial Airline Safety Administration, CASA. The USA Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, will become the Federal Airline Administration, FAA. The European Aviation Safety Authority, EASA, will become the European Airline Safety Administration, and so on and so on. I even like the idea of ICAO changing their name to the International Commercial Airline Organization. The air traffic controllers will be happy as they only deal with professionals within their airspace and ignore the rest unless they ask to come into the airline airspace. Below 10,000 feet, a new organisation needs to be created and a new rule set created. Let's have a clean slate approach and let's keep it simple. Let's call this new organisation the International Aerial Vehicle Administration, IAVA, and any flying vehicle in this airspace is managed by this new entity to a common global standard and common global rule set. Why a pilot outside of Europe has to redo 14 theory exams and be tested again to fly the same aircraft under the same air traffic rules when coming to Europe is completely beyond my understanding. No country is that special that they or we have to have specific rules for our country. That is simply rubbish and protectionism and a government department finding a reason for their existence. If we really think about it, to the helicopter operator, this will be an advantage, as helicopters in this new airspace will no longer have to be managed by a regulator who does not understand them or tries to make them fit into the airline model. Instead, we will join the ranks of the aerial vehicle, and this will open up opportunities and give us power by being supported again by the public who've only recently turned on the helicopter as a perceived noisy, obtrusive invasion of their privacy by the rich and uncaring. Those aerial vehicles will be divided into two distinct categories: toys and aerial vehicles, with the aerial vehicles being divided further into manned and unmanned. A toy is an aerial vehicle less than 2 kgs that is operated on the ground by an operator, but most importantly, it cannot go more than 50 feet away from that operator, or some height and distance yet to be agreed upon. And it most certainly cannot go beyond the line of sight of that operator. At manufacture, It is geofenced and is only used as a toy. It cannot be used for hire or reward. It does not need to be registered, and the person operating it does not need any training. It's a fun thing, a toy. Any other aerial vehicle that is not used in this manner must be registered, operated by a qualified operator pilot who has received relevant training, maintained by a qualified technician, and must be able to be seen on a moving map display by other aerial vehicle operators, and have the ability to communicate either by radio, text, via the internet, autonomously, through programming, or some other means not yet in existence appropriate to where and how it will be operated. This is all the new part. If the aerial vehicle is required to operate within controlled airspace, it must also have an ADS-B transponder and will be required to gain permission prior, with the operator having received specific training to accommodate this ability. The exception to this may be if they have permission to operate in controlled airspace not above 150 feet AGL for a specific job that may be NOTAMed. Communication does not have to be verbal, as autonomous vehicles may send out signals to other aerial vehicles, ensuring the two do not collide. The technology for all of this already exists, and this can all be achieved now very cheaply, less than $100, by using the cell phone system. At our company, we have already installed some of this technology so our helicopters and drones can see each other. There is going to be a catch though. The key to making this happen is for the currently referred to general aviation community to embrace and work with the Googles, Amazons, DHLs and UPSs of the world. They, after all, will have the money and the cash flow and the political muscle to make this all happen. They will create our Uber moment. In fact, they're working very hard to make it happen now. We just have to make sure it is not at our exclusion. We already know what airspace they need to do their business, and in my opinion, they should have it. Asking for 0 to 500 feet AGL over every major city along designated routes with branches off into smaller streets and buildings is not really going to affect the helicopter industry at all. Yes, there will be a small number of idiots out there who will break the rules, but that is what rules are for, right? And in the future, technology can be used to enforce rules with jamming and monitoring, etc. The next question to ask is, just what does a pilot/operator and a maintainer need to know to be in control of an aerial vehicle? Again, this is going to be another paradigm shift. Having a rudimentary knowledge of the new laws applicable to aerial vehicles, some basic aerodynamics, human factors and meteorology may all have some influence as a baseline, but outside of that, it is practical knowledge on how to operate the specific vehicle being flown and utilize the technology you are presented with that is going to be important. Navigation, performance and off-aircraft technical knowledge all go out the window as technology is far too complex and diverse to worry about a shimmy damper or a turbocharger at 10,000 feet, or how a left zero reading amp meter works, or explaining octane ratings in fuel is all now irrelevant when operating a quadcopter with 8 electric motors, 1 power cell and no other moving parts. The car is the classic example. We all drive one without even thinking. Who can tell me how the modern car actually works? Anyone pulled apart the electronic ignition or the engine management system over the weekend just because you can? No, I think not. In fact, as we move into electric and hybrid models, our past knowledge of the petrol-driven car is now being left behind. Who here pops the bonnet and works on the engine these days? I don't think we even change tyres as we make an emergency call and a dispatcher comes out and sorts it for us while we remain safe in the vehicle. Who, when getting their driver's license, does nothing more than a law exam, then practical driving test? Why is the aerial vehicle any different if it is the modern day car? 100 hours of practical, a test followed by L plates, P plates, then an open license followed by some add-ons based on task and complexity. I have no doubt there is way more to consider, but the point is these are the types of questions and discussions we need to be having now. Our regulators have proven over time that they are not going to be able to cope with the pace of change that is happening today, nor do we want them anywhere near this. To give an Australian example why, I offer the following. In 1988, a young Kiwi by the name of Mike Becker came across the ditch from New Zealand to Australia with his wife and $5,000 in his pocket. Having rung ahead and spoken to the then CAA, Civil Aviation Authority, he knew he had to do a law exam and a flight test to convert his Kiwi licence to an Australian one. At the time, the school he went to was HeliFlight at Castle Hills. They told him about a change to the rules. The Civil Aviation Authority were moving some of the civil aviation regulations and orders and caps and circulars into a new document called a CASA, Civil Aviation Safety Regulation, full of parts 61, 141, 142, 92, 133, 137, and so on. It is now 2019 and we are still in transition from the old regulations to the new regulations. It has taken 31 years just to update some rule books. How on earth are our regulators going to cope with a new rule set to accommodate the very fast changing technological aviation environment of today? Their past record says they can't. Of course, this was all sold as no cost to the industry, right? I was once told that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. I guess that makes our regulators certifiably insane. So what am I saying? What is the point of this talk? I'm saying we need to embrace the change to ensure the survival of our industry. I'm saying we need a paradigm shift, but that is only going to come about if we embrace the new technology rolling very quickly over our horizon. I'm saying we should consider self-regulation or form a new regulatory body that is applicable to our operations below 10,000 feet outside the controlled airspace. And that it should be a global rule set, not just one country coming up with its interpretation from ICAO. And most importantly, it should include any man-made object that can fly. I'm saying we need to team up with the drone and UAV community and together determine our collective aviation destiny. And it has to start right now. Let's be best buddies. Let's look at the big picture. I'm flagging to our incumbent regulators from around the world that we need to do things differently, to embrace new thinking, to sit down, shut up and hang on, because it's going to be a wild ride whether we and they acknowledge it or not. This change will only be driven by us collectively agreeing on a new way and making our desire for this change known, and then getting associations such as the HAI and others on board to lead the change. Thanks for your time, and I hope to see you in the air.